Hello everyone, so welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today's video was inspired by one of you, as in the comments of my recent video Armor Doesn't Exist, the rant video where I, if you haven't watched it, link in the description below of course, and it's a video where I talk about this fact that in Hollywood films often armor is just like a decoration, it doesn't work, and people just cut through it with swords, which is absolutely impossible depending on the armor, but for most kinds of armor that is shown in film it just wouldn't work. So I talked about this, and one of you actually made an interesting comment, and he asked me, but if swords were so ineffective against armor, then what are swords good for? And that is a very good question, so thank you very much. Oh my gosh, where are you from, mate? I mean, this name, I'll try. Bjorn. Gosh, your surname, Wachelstedt. Can I call you Claudius Flavius? Okay, so what are swords good for? I mean, on that video I talked a lot about how a sword would be ineffective, a very ineffective weapon to use against a fully armored opponent, because if the opponent is wearing mail, or if he's wearing any form of plate from Lorica segmentata of the Romans to the, of course, late medieval plate armor, and it would be basically impossible to cut through that armor. So one thing we need to keep in mind is, first, we need to understand that the word sword is an umbrella term, a huge umbrella term. So in other words, there are so many different implements that we call swords, and they are so different among each other that it's really difficult to say swords are good for this or swords are bad for that. So for example, yes, this is a sword, 13th century Oakeshott type 12, beautiful sword, if you don't mind me saying that. But this is not the only thing that we call sword. For example, a Roman gladius and a Japanese nodachi, they are all swords, aren't they? But the way you use them, their purposes, the way they're built, even the way you carry them, anything about a gladius and a nodachi is different. So much so that I would say that a gladius and a nodachi are so different that there is more difference between a gladius and a nodachi, and they're both swords, than there is between a pike and a halberd. Because a pike and a halberd are polearms, and a nodachi and a gladius are swords. So sword, the word sword, is similar to the word polearm. For example, we have got swords that are actual battlefield weapons. For example, the nodachi and the gladius. These are main weapons used by the soldiers, in that case the Roman legionaries, as their main weapon to fight their opponents. But there are many other swords, like for example the 13th century medieval sword that I showed you, that is not a main battlefield weapon, and neither is the katana a main battlefield weapon. Okay, so for example, swords in general, for the majority of cases, so exception being nodachi and gladius, and we will get back to both of those, but for the majority of cases a sword is not a main battlefield weapon, but it's a sidearm, so something that you can wear in town, and that you can wear, I'd like to underline, something that you can keep on yourself easily and that you can use for self-defense and for duel. So a sidearm, something you use for self-defense, not a main battlefield weapon. On the battlefields, those kind of swords were backup weapons. It would be a backup weapon for a knight, for example, who would use either a polearm or a mace or a warhammer as his main weapons, or a lance, in fact, if he was on horseback. It would be a backup weapon for the samurai caste, because the katana, for example, because they wouldn't be using those as main battlefield weapons. The main battlefield weapons would be the kanabo, would be the nodachi, could be polearms, naginata, yari, and of course the bow. And talking bows, the medieval sword that I've just showed you would be a good backup weapon also for archers, because an archer, of course, his main weapon would be the bow. So the reason why polearms, the reason why bows, and the reason why blunt weapons such as the mace or the warhammer are main battlefield weapons is because they are very effective against armor. And when you're in the battlefield, most of your opponents are going to wear armor, and that's why they are more effective, and they have got reach advantage. A nodachi is huge, it's massive, it's basically a polearm, isn't it? And of course spears, yari, naginata, pikes, halberds, they give you a huge reach advantage, and believe me, reach advantage is probably the most important thing. The idea of hitting your opponent without being hit, because your weapon has got more range, is probably the most significant of all elements that you would look for in a weapon. Also, another thing important to say is that polearms are a lot less expensive to produce and therefore mass produce than swords are. So that's another element that makes them into a main battlefield weapon. You could say that all Norse warriors had a spear, but not all Norse warriors could afford a sword. And of course the bow would be the preferred weapon of archers, clearly, but also of the samurai. So the samurai were archers and sometimes mounted archers. On the other hand, the reason why these battlefield weapons would not be good in an urban context is because you can't walk around with a pike, you know? It's not like in video games that either weapons disappear in your inventory, or you just, you take your pike and it magnetically sticks to your back and you walk around and it just goes through things, through walls and through people. Imagine, even if you could put a pike and put it in your back, secure it in your back, imagine what would happen each time you turn. You will be hitting people, smashing vases, hitting people in the eye, hitting windows, hitting walls, and you couldn't even walk inside any building because you couldn't pass through the corridor. So, and that would be a similar situation. Yes, a mace can be worn, and even a warhammer can be worn, but it's not comfortable to wear, and it wouldn't be very effective because, first, maces and warhammers tend to be shorter in range than swords. Okay, they are very close quarter combat weapons. There are some exceptions, of course, but again, if they are too big, if we go into the realms of polearms, then we said that you can't really wear them and carry them in town. And on the other hand, why would you? If you were to fight in a duel, if you were attacked by thugs in town, okay, or you had to have a duel of honor, well, you're not wearing armor, and your opponent is not going around with a full plate armor kit or in full mail attacking people, right? So if your opponent is not wearing armor, the sword is perfect, because differently from a blunt implement, differently from a mace, in order to in order for it to be effective against an opponent, you either need to hit him in the head and crack his skull, or you need to hit him really hard, and break the bones somewhere, like break a rib. But you need a lot of force. With this, you can hit anywhere in the body, and you don't need much force. You just need good edge alignment, and you will cut. Okay, so not having to commit too much to a very strong blow is good, because it allows you to be more nimble. It also sort of limits your possibilities of getting hit back, okay, as you recover from your attacks. So this is good, because in the very moment that you open a cut anywhere in the body of your opponent, there is your chance for the fight to be over. You don't necessarily need to kill your opponent to win a fight. And again, that's something that in video games they portray in a wrong way. You see how now they have started changing this with some mods as well, but if you notice it, in most video games, when thug and bandits attack you, they fight until death. Now that is a lot of commitment and dedication, I gotta say, because even in war, not everyone fought until death. People's ran away. The Templars were rather famous for fighting until death. But, Crusaders is a little bit of a different, we could consider them to be fanatics, religious fanatics, but that's a completely different context. But if you open, let's say that you have got this thug, this bandit, and he's attacking you, but you've got your sword and you're pretty good at using it. So you manage to cut him a nasty wound here, where his bicep is, and he starts bleeding. Now the first thing that comes to the mind of that person is, never mind, I'm not going to die just for robbing this guy, he's too good, and he'll just run away. The cut might get infected, we are still in medieval times, hygiene is not really at its peak. People washed, and I will make a video on this, there is a lot of misconception. I had this misconception as well, of medieval people never washing themselves. They did, they bathed, and there is proof for this, and I will talk about this, but still, hygiene wasn't as good as it is today. Okay, and that's the same for Roman times. So you open you cut a finger off, you cut a nasty wound here, or anywhere really, the person is most likely going to renounce and going to run away. And again, a lot easier to achieve this with a sword than it is with any other weapon. But of course, if the opponent is in full armor, you don't really want to use a sword, because if you do, it's going to be really difficult to get through that armor. And that's why swords are almost never main battlefield weapons. And I did say there are some exceptions. One is the Japanese nodachi. But the Japanese nodachi, again, is not really a sword per se. It's massive. It has the reach of a polearm. It was often used as an anti-cavalry weapon. It's a special situation. So you use it and you ditch it when you stop. You don't need it anymore. You just use it for specific situations. That's how they used it in Japan. And the gladius. What about the gladius? Now, the gladius and the Romans are the one big exception to this rule. They did use the gladius, which is a sword, as their main battlefield weapon, and it worked. But in order to understand this, we need to first examine what the gladius is and then who their opponents were. So first off, the gladius is very different from a katana or from a medieval European Oakeshott type 12 or whatever weapon, a long sword, because it's a sword mostly designed for stabbing. Now, mind you, they did use it, they did cut with it as well. We do have proof of this during the Dacian Wars, for example, of soldiers being dismembered, and if you need to dismember someone, you need to cut. You can't dismember someone stabbing. But for the majority of cases, the gladius was used as a stabbing implement and always in conjunction with a scutum. In other words, a gladius without a scutum, it's not as effective. But I think the main and most important thing that we need to keep in mind is that for the majority of cases, and I would say 99% of cases, maybe 95, whatever, the Romans faced opponents who were not in armor. In the classical antiquity, it's not like in the Middle Ages where pretty much every soldier could afford at least a helmet and people had padded jackets and gambesons, and then you had many opponents in mail. And for example, there are many battles like the Battle of Agincourt where basically everyone was fully armored with even plate armor, etc. But in classical antiquity, Rome was the only civilization that could afford and had the economic basis, which is what you need, to armor up each single soldier in full armor, helmet, armor, etc. The only ones. So what that means is that every time they fight the Gauls, every time they fight whatever population they're fighting, only the leaders of that population will have full armor, but the majority won't. They will have weapons, but they won't have armor, because again, it's a peculiarity of the Roman Empire and the Roman Republic. There are some exceptions to that. I think during the Second Punic War, Hannibal had pretty well equipped armies. In fact, the Romans don't beat them, but at least at first, you needed the genius Scipio Africanus to get to destroy them. But for all other situations throughout the centuries and centuries of Roman warfare, they fought people who weren't armored. So this was the perfect implement of combat for that situation. So, to reiterate, a sword is an excellent weapon, but first off, we need to choose which sword we're talking about before giving too generic information that is too generic. And secondly, it's good for certain tasks, but you don't have a weapon that is perfect for everything. Otherwise, everyone would have been armed up with that. When you have to choose how to arm your armies, you need to consider who you're going to fight, you need to consider how they are equipped, and you need to consider how much money you've got to arm them up. Weapons have got costs, and some weapons are more effective in certain scenarios, and other weapons are more effective in other scenarios. The sword is an excellent dual weapon. It's an excellent self-defense weapon. It's something that you can easily carry with you in town, differently from other weapons that are actually, like, imagine going around with an odachi. That doesn't happen in reality. You go around with a katana, and sometimes when you enter towns in feudal Japan, you would even remove your katana if you enter, for example, a home, and you would just carry your wakizashi, because it's difficult to walk around with a big object on your hips or on your back. Okay, well, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much to Claudius Flavius for his question, which sort of inspired me into making this video. If you like this video, please remember thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Roma invicta!